Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be painting this bakery storefront. This ended up being such a long and complex one, which wasn't part of the plan, but I just went a bit overboard. I think this took me around 7 to 8 hours to film with a total of around 5 hours of footage, and this is the shortest I feel like I can cut it down to, so let's get right to it. Before I started this painting, I made a few smaller sketches to figure out the features that I want to include in the composition, including the rough ideation of colors. Then I made a larger version where I make the features look a bit clearer. I also decided to change the second story design to this cafe bakery. I was quite satisfied with how it looks so far, so I brought it across to my tablet to try out the color combination. I knew I wanted brick walls and green frames for the door and windows and things, but I wasn't too sure about the color of the roof. Initially, I wanted a terracotta roof, but I was worried about the color blending too much with the bricks, so I also tried this burgundy color as well. But at the end, I felt like the terracotta color brightens the composition, so I decided to stick with the original idea. Here I'm just going to start sketching everything out. I wanted to make this one easy for myself, so at least I have a good base to the painting, so I used a ruler to draw the bottom line. This wasn't really a ruler, but I'll tell you the story later. Then I freehand the rest just to have a nice base sketch. I'm not going to voice over too much for the sketching portion since I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Here I'm just doing a very loose, light base sketch with my HB pencil to get the features down. If you want to get right into painting though, I will also have this available in my coffee shop. You guys might probably have to remind me to actually publish because that's what usually happens when I say that I have certain outlines in my coffee shop. I tend to forget because I schedule my videos and I'm not actually in front of the computer when my video is being published. So I'm sorry about that, but I will definitely have it ready for you guys. So about the ruler, I don't know if you guys noticed, but this is something that I filmed when I was in Austria, and when I was there, I didn't bring basic tools like rulers because I thought that it would be easily available in any shop. There were two shops close to my apartment, and when I went over there to check on the stationery section, they didn't have rulers. What I found out is that I have to go to an actual stationery shop to get it, or I have to go to this shop called Action where it sells sort of like house supplies basically. These shops though are not at walking distance and I would have to take public transport to get there, and it would just take too much time and I would burn daylight basically. So I went back home and tried to look for alternatives, but everything was a bit too flimsy or wasn't accurate enough for me to use as a ruler. So I messaged my husband, who was over at Latvia for a week for a concert job, just to see if he has any hidden supplies of rulers or something like that. And he said no. The only thing he had were calipers, which he uses to make his oboe reeds. And since that was the only non-flimsy thing that was available to me, I ended up using them, but I didn't like it because it was very clunky and it was hard to move around. So I freehand most of the sketch except for parts which might be a bit difficult for me to get the accuracy correctly, like longer lines and things like that. I really wanted to make this one easy on myself, but it ended up backfiring. But now I see the benefit of practicing to draw straight lines freehand without a ruler all these years. Anyway, getting back to the sketching portion, after I've made the loose sketch with my HB pencil and I know where the features are mostly going to go, I went over it just to make clearer lines with my 6B pencil. And this is also where I started adding a bit more details. You do want to make sure that the darker, softer pencil is nice and sharp though. This way it's a bit easier for you to draw out accurately, which makes it much easier for you to follow when you're outlining later. I find that 6B is a bit too dark though, so I would suggest for you to use 2B instead. I would actually prefer to draw this out with my usual mechanical pencil, but just like the ruler, I didn't bring them. So that's what I had to make do with, just the 6B pencil that was available to me. Anyway, I'm fairly happy with the sketch now, so let's go over the colors. This is Lamp Black by Daniel Smith, Graphite Grey by Daniel Smith, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Winsor Red by Winsor & Newton, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Jaune Brilliant by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Chinese White by Holbein, Cobalt Blue Hue by Holbein, Sap Green by Holbein, Hooker's Green by Cotman, and I will also be using Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. The first thing that I'm going to paint are flowers on the pots that I've drawn out. I've also erased parts of the pots at the back just to make sure I don't get any pencil lines showing through. For the color of these flowers, I used a mix of vermilion, Jaune Brilliant with a little bit of Quin Red. As you're painting the flowers, you want to make sure that the load on your brush is fairly light so you don't have areas which are puddling up. Because after I've painted the flowers, I want to paint on the greeneries where I use Sap Green with Hansa Yellow to create a light yellow green. And I just place this green around the flowers that I've already painted so far. So if your flowers are puddling, the green is going to just blend with the rest of the flowers that you painted earlier. For the flowers at the back, I use Cobalt Blue with a little bit of Quin Red and also white to create this pastel purple color. Then I'm going to also fill the rest of the area in with the green. I'm just going to paint on the plants on the pots really quickly. So next, I want to paint a tree. I use burnt umber to paint the stem, and before I paint on the flowers and the leaves, I make sure to erase parts of the building so the pencil lines doesn't show through. I want to add flowers to this tree, and for the flowers, I use a deep yellow mix. So that's from Hansa Yellow Medium with a tiny bit of vermilion to just turn it into an orange yellow slightly. As for the greeneries, I use the exact same green as before from Hansa Yellow Medium with a little bit of Sap Green, but I'm still going to build on the colors later on. I'm just placing more branches around the tree so it doesn't look too static, and I'm just going to add on more flowers and leaves around the branches that I've already painted until I get a composition that I'm satisfied with. I also want to add greeneries on top of the roof on the first floor, just running along from left to right and then hanging on the side slightly. For this, I started with the same mix with Hansa Yellow Medium with Sap Green, but this time I'm going to play around with the ratio since we are painting on a large area. This way, the greeneries doesn't look too flat. If I want a darker green, I would add more Sap Green, but at the same time, if you want to use a deeper sort of green color with just the Sap Green by itself, but you want the color to be lighter, you can also use a thinner consistency. So playing with the ratio as well as the consistency will give you different values. After I get a pretty good coverage, I actually like to go back in with just the Sap Green by itself, and I just dot around certain areas to darken parts while the surface is still wet, and I'm just going to let the colors travel by themselves. I also want to add a rectangular bush at the front to act as an entryway to this bakery. I want the light to come from the top section, which is why I'm making it much lighter in comparison to the front side of the bush, and I also try to separate the side nearest to the entryway as well. I'm going to make two of these, one on the left and one on the right. Since the door is closer to the left, I decided to make the bush a little bit smaller on the left hand side, but I tried to make the height as similar as possible. Going back to the greeneries on the roof, I want to bring down some of the leaves just to make the placement a little bit more flowy. But before I add the extensions, I make sure to erase parts of the roof where I want to extend the leaves downwards. The reason why I painted all the plants first is because I don't want to draw them out with pencil, and these plants will more likely overlap the features of the building, so I painted them lightly to indicate the rough amount of space each plant would need. These boxes that I'm redrawing here were a bit too small in terms of the scale in comparison to the rest of the building and the chairs and stuff like that, so I decided to redraw it again and make it a bit larger. These are just basically decorative elements, and I also place pots around them, so I'm going to paint on the plants on these pots as well, just to indicate the spacing. For the first pot at the top here, I want to create tall vertical flowers. For this, I want to make it purple, and I use a mix of Quin Red, Cobalt Blue, and Chinese White. I then take off the excess paint to make it even lighter and also to dry off the surface. Then I go back in with the same color mixture without the white to create a darker purple color. For the second one, I just want to make cascading leaves on this pot, so I use the same green mixture from Sap Green with Hansa Yellow Medium, and I use the rest of the green to fill in some of the green areas underneath the flowers that I painted earlier. I want to make the color of the flowers fairly consistent, so I want to use the same exact mixture as I did for the first flower, which is from Jaune Brilliant Vermilion and a little bit of Quin Red. After I've painted all of the greeneries and plants, I already have a good idea of the spacing for all of the composition now, so I'm going to go ahead and outline the rest of the features. I'm starting with the chairs here, and then I'm going to move on to outline the building as well. I'm outlining with my Sakura Micron pen in 0.1 Sepia, but it's completely up to you. You can use different colors or different weights depending on the look that you're going for. You can even use brush pens if you want the lines to have an even weight, but it will give out a different character to your painting. For the longer lines of this sketch, I prefer to have the longer lines perfectly ruled with pencil first. Then when I outline it, I follow the straight line freehand. When I'm outlining freehand, the lines might be a tiny bit wobbly, and I would personally take my pen off the paper if my grip can no longer follow the straight line, which then leave areas where there are spaces in between the lines. Personally, I find that these imperfect lines give a bit more character and a human touch to the outlines in comparison to doing the pen outline with a ruler, which might feel more like a technical drawing, but this is just a personal choice, and this is also why I go out of my way to practice sketching straight lines freehand whenever I can. But in certain cases like this one where time is important, that's when I use the aid of a ruler, especially for longer lines, and this is just to reduce the filming and production time. I'm not telling you guys to do the same, but I'm just sharing my thoughts on this matter, and these things are personal choices, and it just depends on the kind of things you find important to practice for yourself. So I'm just going to finish off the outline, and then we'll get to painting. So after I finished with the outline, I actually forgot to press record, so there's quite a large portion of this painting that I skipped. So let me start out with the roof. For the roof, I used Quin Sienna. I used Quin Sienna as is for the base color, then after it has dried off, I used a slightly thicker consistency to layer on the lines, and this will create the railings of the roof. As for the front portion where it's much darker, I added burnt umber to the Quin Sienna just to darken the color. As for the green of the door that I'm painting here, as well as the frame of this building, I used Hooker's Green mixed with the previous roof mixture, so Hooker's Green with a bit of Sepia and Quin Sienna to mute the color further. Now the more complex part is actually the bread window. For the base warm gray of the window, I use a mix of Quin Sienna with Graphite Grey. And for this window, I also use Hansa Yellow Medium, Burnt Umber, and Quin Red. These are the colors that I use to create the breads and things like that. And I just keep on layering while the surface is still slightly damp, which is why you can see that the lines are not overly clear either. For the color of the breads, I like to use Burnt Umber, Quin Sienna, Quin Red, and also Hansa Yellow. I would just alternate the color until I find the tone that I like, and I keep on layering for darker values. And just by layering and playing with the values, you can start to create or suggest shapes of the bread. I painted this completely freehand, so I just added more things and more things until I create somewhat of a scene of the bakery. But I'll just paint another one on the door here so you get what I mean. As you can tell, the surface is still slightly damp, and I'm just making up different tones of browns in order to divide up the space with the bread shelves. Then I added Hansa Yellow Medium to the brown mix to create a lighter brown for the bread. I'm just painting blobs here, and at the bottom I added more sepia in the mix to create a darker brown and layered it on. As you can see, everything is painted fairly loosely. I just painted blobs basically, but because of the context of the overall painting, it suggests the shapes of bread. At the very least, when I painted the larger window, I did imagine a very loose composition. I wanted to include a bread basket with baguettes and bread loaves, and because I've already painted those two types of bread, which are distinctive, the rest is just brown blobs, and that is actually enough context for our brain to imagine what the rest of the displayed items are. And everything after that is more about layering the darker values to create depth and form in the display window. So moving along, I'm going to paint the second story. For this, I used a mixture of Jaune Brilliant, Buff Titanium, and Hansa Yellow Medium. As you can see, I'm painting it in a very patchy way, so the surface looks uneven. This is actually intentional because if I paint it as a neat wash, I find that the surface would look too flat. After that, I dried everything off with a hairdryer, and then I layer on the exact same color on top as the design of the exterior. The part between the plants and the roof is divided into 3 sections. For the middle section, I'm just going to paint it yellow for now, and at the bottom, just behind the roof, I'm going to use the same color as the roof for now, which is Quin Sienna. Moving on to the exterior of the ground floor, I used the same mix, but I added Quin Sienna and Hansa Yellow. I used a medium consistency to cover mostly those areas except for the frames. And I want pretty good coverage here because I want to layer on the brick textures once it's completely dry. For the roof at the top, I decided to use Quin Sienna to make it consistent with the roof of the ground floor. I want to create a cool gray color for the lamps on the sides, and for that I use a mix of Cobalt blue with Graphite Grey. I'm also going to use the same cool blue mix for the shadows of the roof. And after that, I'm going to leave it to dry and paint on lines for added detail as well as added depth. For the tablecloth, I'm going to create the classic red checker design, but you can always create different types of designs and color combinations. For the boxes, you can use any tone of brown or even other hues. For me, I just use whatever I had left on my palette, and then I mix more Quin Sienna and Buff Titanium. And as for the bottom one, I added Hansa Yellow to make the tone slightly more yellowish. For the pots, I wasn't too sure what color I wanted to be, so I just mixed a bunch of colors to create different tones of purples and blues. I used mostly a mix of Cobalt blue, Graphite Grey, Quin Red, to make the blue a bit brighter, and also buff titanium if I want the color to be a bit more pastel. For the floor, I used the previous blue mix with added graphite gray and buff titanium to create this neutral gray color, and I'm just going to cover the whole area. For the front face of the pavement, I'm just going to use the exact same mix, but I added more graphite gray in the mix to darken it further. Here I want to frame off the bakery, so I decided to add more greens, and after that I also added just sap green to darken certain areas of this part here, and this is just to make clearer angles on the bush. For the details of the door, I use a thicker consistency of hooker's green with a bit of graphite gray in the mix to just darken it further. I'm just going to frame the door as well as add details and also shadows around the frame of the window. For the details of the roof tiles, I mix burnt umber with Quin Sienna, and I just follow the lines that I've already painted earlier, and I make curves in between. After that, I also decided to reline some of the sides to make it a bit more three-dimensional, and you can see a little bit more of the layering on the tiles. I want to add the darker values with more Quin Sienna just to increase the contrast, and this time I also try to extend the shadows a little bit more. This way the light area of the tiles will become much thinner, and this will act as the highlight of each curve. In the middle of those darker areas, I made the value a little bit darker, so there's a gradation within each curve where the darkest value is where the deepest part of the curves are. And just to define the details a little bit further, I'm just going to add a line underneath each of the curves. For the roof at the top, I'm also going to add shadows underneath each tile using Quin Sienna. For the window frame on the second story, I want it to be a neutral color since I want it to still look white. And for the shadow color, I use a mix of buff titanium, cobalt blue, and graphite gray. I also want to darken the ridges of the exterior here. I actually use the same mixture for the shadow underneath the rooftop. After this, I'm going to paint on the bricks. For the color, I use a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium with Vermilion to create this orange color. It's so much easier to paint the bricks with a flat brush, but as I was doing this, I realized that I didn't have my flat brush with me either. So I tried using my normal round brush to paint this, and it just got too tedious because it was really hard to get straight edges. And while I was getting frustrated, I remembered that I do have a flat brush, but it's not a watercolor brush, it's actually my nail art brush. So this is what you see me using right now, and it actually turned out being the perfect size for this painting. So getting back to the painting, to paint on the bricks, as you can see, I just hold my brush in a straight line and paint it on using the flat side. I try to overlap the placement every time I paint a different row. And I also go over things like the lamp as well as the chairs because I will be painting them using a dark color later on. So it's completely fine to paint the brick texture right on top of them. On this part of the exterior where I painted yellow or the same color as the second story, I ended up painting bricks. I just felt like this area needed a bit of texture. Then after that, I used the same hooker's green mix to paint the framing on that section of the exterior as well. To To give more character to the bricks, I glaze over some browns that I had left on my palette. It doesn't really matter what tone of brown you have. Some can be a bit more yellow or darker or lighter. I just want to use this to create some color changes within the brick, so I glazed it over certain areas randomly. Here I'm just adding more detail to the tablecloth. I used the same Winsor Red in a thick consistency, and this time I made the lines a bit thinner just to add some layering to the design. For the outdoor lamps, I used lamp black, very appropriate color, and I use a very thick consistency of this while leaving out some white space wherever I can. You can also use a smaller brush for this, but to make the process easier, you can also just paint it all black and then use bleed-proof white later on to paint on the highlights. For the store handle, I just use a thick consistency of Hansa Yellow Medium. I just want to keep the chair simple, so I just use black, but I think dark brown would also look really nice for this. Next, I want to add more details to the railings and the framing of this building. I'm just going to use Hooker's Green as the main color, and you can darken it by either using Sepia, Graphite Grey, or a little bit of Lamp Black. At the moment, I feel like the roof is blending a little bit too much with the brick walls, so I want to separate those two areas by adding a shadow underneath the roof. For that, I use a mix of graphite gray and cobalt blue. I want the top part of the shadow to be a bit darker where it's touching the roof, and as it gets lower to the building, I lighten it by using a thinner consistency. I've left out some parts of the framing, so I'm just going to add it on now. And after this, I also want to add details or reflections on the glass area of the lamp, so I use the same shadow mix from graphite gray and cobalt blue just to add some diagonal lines. Using the same shadow color of cobalt blue with graphite gray, I'm going to use my nail art flat brush again, and I use a thin consistency of this color to paint the stonework on the pavement. This is probably my favorite part of the painting, just like the bricks. I really enjoy painting these types of textures. It's so simple to make, and yet I think it brings so much to the painting. So I'm just going to continue on. You can also make different types of patterns, but I decided to go with this arching pattern. Just like the bricks, I'm going to layer on the same color mixture, but this time I added more cobalt blue just to bring up the saturation, and I'm just layering parts of the stone so the colors are a little bit more varied, and I just find that this brings more interest to the painting as well. Still using the same color mixture, I'm just glazing on some shadows for the stairs. Then I'm going to build the darker colors on the plants. For the plants, I use the same mix as before with Sap Green and Hansa Yellow, but I use a thicker consistency and a bit more Sap Green. Sometimes I like to also add in a little bit of Quin Sienna for an even darker green with more warmth. As for the flowers, I use the same color mixtures as I did to make those flowers, but in a thicker consistency this time, and I just dot some parts of the flowers for added detail. As for the tree, I decided to add more distinct leaf shapes just for a variation in the texture, and I also did the same for the flowers as well. I like to also darken some parts of the leaf since it does take up quite a large area, so I do want to break it down a little bit more and introduce darker values to give some form of depth. Here I went back to the shadow mix again of cobalt blue with graphite gray, and I paint on shadows underneath the plants, just on the pots. As for the brown pot though, I used Quin Red with a little bit of sepia. I also added some more details on the boxes here. I just added lines so it looks like wooden crates. Here I'm just going to darken and add texture to the bushes. I'm darkening the front faces, but I want the sides to be even darker, and for the top faces to be the lightest section of these bushes. By doing this, it will add so much more form to this whole painting, and you can see that it looks more cubic this way. To finish these bushes off, I just want to add more texture for the lightest section at the top as well. And here I'm just scattering the brush strokes randomly using the same dark green mix. I also want to darken the value of the wooden crate, so I use sepia with burnt umber. And I want one part to be a bit darker while still keeping the texture of the wooden crates. Next, I want to add details to the bush on top of the roof as well. And for this, I just added more leaf shapes and scattered them around, especially around the sides where the leaves are cascading downwards. Here I'm going to add some darker patches as well at the bottom to serve as shadows. I'm going to add a giant sign on the window here. I started out by using a medium to thin consistency of bleed-proof white just because it's very opaque, and I just want to somewhat sketch it out to get the placement right. Then after I've gotten the placement correct, I went over it again with a thicker consistency, and I basically just drew out this croissant, and I'm going to write bakery at the top. On the window of the door, I'm just going to paint on this white oval using a medium consistency of bleed-proof white, and I'm just going to take off the excess paint with tissue. While I wait for this to dry, I'm going to paint on some white flowers on the bushes at the top, as well as adding some white highlights for the smaller pots as well. And then I want to make sure that the white flowers are dry so I can add a thick consistency of Hansa Yellow for the center of those flowers. Here I use the same shadow mixture again with Graphite Grey and Cobalt Blue, and I'm just going to add some cast shadows underneath the pots and boxes. I'm also going to add cast shadows for the lamp as well as the plants. After that, I'm going to go back to the sign and use my Sakura Micron pen to write open on the sign. I'm just going to do one last detail, which is just to add breads at the bottom. I added lines using this brown, and I just softened the edges. Because I painted this on a large piece of paper, I'm just going to cut off the top section where there's extra space. And we are finally done with this painting. This is probably the longest tutorial that I've ever done so far, and probably will do, since making this really set me back on my schedule. And despite having so much fun painting this one, it's unfortunately not sustainable for me to keep up due to my lack of available time. I know you guys really enjoy storefront paintings though, so I think I'll stick with a smaller scale in the future, and please just take this one as a one-off treat. Like usual, all the list of tools that I used for this painting will be on my description box, including the coffee outline. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for sticking right to the end of this very long video, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!